The morning my father handed me a $500 check and told me never to come back. Diana was standing behind him, smiling. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just looked at him one last time and walked out into the Houston heat, not knowing that the woman who had stolen my family was not finished with me yet. Not even close. The check was crisp. $500 folded, once held out between two fingers, like it was something dirty my father didn't want to touch for too long. I stared at it for a moment, just a moment, before I took it from his hand. "That should cover a cab," my father, Harrison Caldwell, said. His voice was flat, rehearsed, like he had practiced saying those words in the mirror that morning, and convinced himself they were reasonable. Behind him, Diana stood in the doorway of the sitting room. She was his wife, my stepmother, though I had never once called her that out loud. She wore a silk robe, the color of cream, and she was smiling. Not a big smile, just the corners of her mouth barely lifted. The kind of smile that knows it has already won. I had lived in that house for 3 years after my mother passed. 3 years of making myself small, making myself useful, making myself invisible, so that Diana would have nothing to complain about. 3 years of quiet dinners, where I spoke only when spoken to, of birthday mornings that came and went without a single word from anyone, of watching my father slowly become someone I no longer recognized, someone who looked through me instead of at me. And still, even after all of that, some stubborn, foolish part of me had believed it would not end like this. The Caldwell estate sat in River Oaks, one of the oldest and most affluent neighborhoods in Houston, Texas. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns were always perfect and the neighbors never asked questions. The house itself was enormous, red brick, white columns, magnolia trees lining the front drive. I had grown up visiting this place on weekends when my parents were still married. Back then, it had felt like something out of a storybook. That morning, standing in the marble foyer with a $500 check in my hand, it felt like a courthouse. "Dad," I said the word carefully. Just one word, a last attempt. Harrison Caldwell did not meet my eyes. He was 61 years old, still broad-shouldered, still the kind of man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. But that morning, his gaze was fixed somewhere around my collarbone, as though looking directly at my face was something he could not bring himself to do. "This isn't up for discussion, Serena," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. I looked at the way his jaw was set, the way his hands were clasped in front of him, the slight tension in his shoulders that told me he was not as calm as he was pretending to be. Then I looked past him at Diana, who had not moved, who was still wearing that small, patient smile, and I understood. This had not been his idea, but he had agreed to it, and that was the same thing. I did not cry. I want to make that very clear. I did not cry. Not because I was not hurting, but because I had decided somewhere between waking up that morning and walking down those stairs that I would not give Diana Caldwell the satisfaction of watching my face fall apart. I tucked the check into the pocket of my jeans. "Okay," I said. That was all. Just okay. I walked to the hall closet and pulled out the single bag I had packed the night before, because some part of me had known even then that this conversation would only go one way. I slung it over my shoulder and walked to the front door. My hand found the brass handle, cool and heavy, and I pulled it open. The Houston heat hit me immediately, thick and breathless, the kind of July morning that makes the air shimmer above the pavement. I stepped outside. The door closed behind me. I did not look back. I made it to my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic that Diana had once referred to as an eyesore in the driveway, before my legs decided they had had enough. I sat down behind the wheel and just breathed for a minute, in and out. The leather seat was already warm from the morning sun. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler was running. Ordinary sounds, ordinary day, except that my whole life had just been handed back to me in an envelope. My hands were shaking. Not from sadness, or not only from sadness. There was something else underneath it, something I did not have a name for yet, something that felt almost like anger, but quieter, steadier, the kind of feeling that does not burn itself out quickly. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel and noticed, as I always did, the watch on my left wrist. It was old, a simple silver watch with a worn leather band and a small crack along the edge of the face. My father had given it to me when I turned 16, back when he still remembered things like birthdays, back when Diana was just a name I had not yet learned to be afraid of. I had never taken it off. Not once in all these years. I pressed my thumb against the cracked crystal face of the watch and held it there. The metal was warm from my skin. It was, I realized, the only thing in that house I was leaving with that actually mattered. I sat in the driveway of the Caldwell estate for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the seconds tick by on that old watch. Then I started the car, backed out of the driveway, and drove away from River Oaks without a plan, without a destination, and with $500 to my name. I had made it about 2 miles down Kirby Drive when my phone rang. The number on the screen was one I did not recognize. A Texas area code, but not Houston. The digits that followed were unfamiliar. I almost let it go to voicemail. I was in no condition to talk to anyone, let alone a stranger. But something made me pull over. Some instinct I could not explain made me press the green button and bring the phone to my ear. "Is this Serena Caldwell?" said the voice on the other end. For a second, I almost hung up. There was something about the formality of it. The way the voice said my full name. Not Serena, the way friends said it, but Serena Caldwell, deliberate and precise, like a name being read off a legal document. "Yes," I said carefully. "This is she. Miss Caldwell, my name is Edward Marsh. I'm a partner at Marsh & Associates, an estate law firm based in Austin. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. I'm calling regarding the estate of Margaret Caldwell." The world outside my car kept moving, a delivery truck rumbling past a woman walking her dog, like it was just another Tuesday morning in Houston. I watched all of it without seeing any of it. My mother, Margaret Caldwell, had passed 14 months earlier, quietly, in a hospice facility on the west side of Houston. I had been there at the end. I had held her hand and said everything that needed saying. When it was over, I had driven home and sat in the dark for a long time. She had not left much behind. Or so I had believed. "I wasn't aware there was an estate," I said. "We went through everything after she passed." "You went through what was visible," Edward said, with the careful tone of a man who had delivered complicated news before. "There were holdings structured deliberately apart from everything else. Your mother was very specific about the timing of this disclosure. I think it would be better to discuss the details in person. Would you be able to come to Austin?" I looked at the check in my lap. $500. The sum total of what my father believed 32 years of being his daughter was worth. "I can be there today," I said. Edward Marsh's office was on the 6th floor of a glass building off Congress Avenue in downtown Austin. He was a trim man in his early 60s with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He stood when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his, the kind of gesture that signals what follows will be significant. He opened the file without preamble. "Your mother came to us 9 years ago to finalize an inheritance from your grandmother, Eleanor Hayes. Among Eleanor's assets was a 31% stake in a small energy company based here in Austin. Your mother inherited that stake and quietly acquired additional shares over the years. By the time of her passing, she held a controlling interest." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. At the top, in clean font, were 2 words I had never seen before. Apex Renewable Energy. Apex recently finalized a long-term energy agreement with the state of Texas, he continued. The company's current valuation is approximately $800 million. I stared at the paper. "Could you say that number again?" He said it again. I said nothing. "There is one additional matter," Edward continued. "Your mother attached a confidentiality condition to the inheritance, a binding legal agreement requiring that you not disclose the nature or value of this inheritance to any outside party, including family members, for a period of 3 years. 3 years? I repeated. She was very deliberate about this. He opened a second folder and read carefully. I know my daughter. If she tells them before she's ready, they will find a way to take it from her. Let her find her footing first. Let her become who she was always meant to be before the world finds out. I had to press my lips together for a long moment. That was my mother, practical, fierce, and 3 steps ahead of everyone, even at the end. I signed the documents 2 hours later. I drove to the Apex offices that same evening as the sun went down over the hill country and turned the Austin skyline amber and rust. The building sat on East 6th Street, not flashy but solid. Solar panels along the roofline. Native Texas plants in a small courtyard out front. The kind of place that meant exactly what it said. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time. My mother had spent years quietly building this for me, shielding it, nurturing it, like something she knew I would one day desperately need. She had done it all without a single word because she had known, the way mothers sometimes know things, long before anyone else does, that the day would come when I needed something no one could reach. I crossed the street and stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the name etched into the glass above the entrance. Apex Renewable Energy. And then standing right there on East 6th Street, with traffic moving past and a warm Texas wind at my back, I cried. Not from grief or shame, not from the particular exhaustion of spending years being made to feel invisible. I cried because of her, because she had believed in something inside me and quietly protected it all this time, and I had never known until now. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, took one slow breath, and walked through the door. The next morning, I arrived early, before most of the staff had come in. Edward had arranged a brief orientation, a building, walk-through introductions to senior leadership, an overview of current projects. I moved through it in a focused daze, asking questions, taking notes in a small notebook I had grabbed at a gas station on the drive up from Houston. By mid-morning, the lobby had filled. I was standing near the front desk, reviewing a document, when something made me look up. Across the lobby, half hidden by a group of people moving toward the elevators, was a face I recognized. I could not place it immediately. No name, no clear context, just that specific, unsettling sensation of familiarity, somewhere it had no business being. The figure was still, watching me with the kind of stillness that looks casual, but is not. I looked directly at them. In the space of a single blink, they were gone. Absorbed into the crowd, stepped behind a column, vanished, the way things sometimes do when you look at them too directly. I stood there a moment longer, document in hand, a quiet chill settling somewhere beneath my ribs. I told myself it was nothing. The long drive, the sleepless night, the sheer strangeness of standing in a building that now carried my name on every legal document. I told myself that, but I did not quite believe it. 3 years will change a person in ways they do not always see coming. When I first walked into Apex, I was a woman with a duffel bag and absolutely no idea what I was doing. I had a controlling interest in an $800 million company and could not have told you the difference between a kilowatt and a megawatt. I learned fast. I had no other choice. The first year, I spent mostly listening in boardrooms, on job sites, in the back of briefings where I was the youngest person present. I read everything I could find. I asked questions that probably made senior staff wince. I made decisions that kept me up at night, but I showed up every single morning before the cleaning crew had finished the lobby. By the second year, Apex had landed 2 major commercial contracts in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and broken ground on a wind development project in the Texas Panhandle. By the third year, I was no longer learning to lead. I was leading, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, I found Rachel. Rachel Torres had applied for the executive assistant position during our expansion phase. A sharp, composed woman in her early 30s who had spent 5 years supporting senior leadership at a logistics firm in San Antonio. What struck me in the interview was not her resume. It was the way she listened, fully present, fully attentive, the kind of person who absorbed information like it personally mattered to her. I hired her on the spot. Over the following 18 months, she became indispensable. She knew my schedule better than I did, managed the executive calendar with quiet precision, and had an uncanny sense of when to speak and when to stay back. She was the first person I called when something went sideways. In a building full of capable people, Rachel Torres was the one I trusted most, which made what I was about to do feel that much more lonely, because something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or pending contracts, something I had been watching for nearly a year with growing unease. My father was disappearing, not physically. Harrison Caldwell was still alive, still living in the River Oaks estate, still the nominal chairman of Caldwell Energy. But in the rare phone calls, we exchanged calls I always initiated. Because he never did, he was not quite himself. Small things at first, he would lose the thread of a sentence and pick it back up somewhere else entirely. He repeated questions he had asked 2 minutes before. Once, he called me Margaret. He caught himself quickly, but not before I heard the confusion underneath genuine, disoriented confusion that no man simply stumbles into by accident. My mother's name. He had called me by my mother's name. I told myself it was age, stress, the wear of a man in his early 60s running a demanding company. I told myself that for 8 months. Then I called him one Sunday afternoon, and Diana answered instead. She did not know it was me calling. I could tell by the half-second pause, the slight recalibration in her voice as she decided how to handle it. She said Harrison was resting. She said he had been tired lately. She told me with that particular warmth she deployed like a tool that she would let him know I called. He never called back. That was when I stopped telling myself it was nothing. I found Mike Harlan through a referral from one of our corporate attorneys, a private investigator who had spent 12 years with the Houston Police Department before going independent. He was in his late 40s, unremarkable in appearance, in the specific way that made him effective, with a methodical approach that reminded me of Edward Marsh. He asked precise questions, took careful notes, and offered no opinions until he had something worth standing behind. I told him what I knew, the changed behavior on the phone calls. The Sunday afternoon, Diana had answered, and my father had never called back. I told him I wanted to understand what was happening inside that house. Not assumptions, just facts. Harlan listened without interrupting. "I'll start with observation," he said. "Public patterns first. If there's something to find, we'll find it carefully." He was back 6 weeks later. The report he set on my desk was thin, a few pages, photographs clipped to the back. He walked me through it quietly, the way someone does when they are not entirely sure how the other person will take what they are about to say. Diana had been observed on 4 separate occasions, visiting a small, independent pharmacy on the far east side of Houston, 30 minutes from River Oaks, with no logical reason to be on her route. Each visit was brief, cash only. No prescriptions on file under her name at that location. No record of Harrison being a patient there either. Harlan placed one photograph on top of the report. Diana, stepping out of the pharmacy door, with a small paper bag held close to her side, large sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. The timestamp read, 7:43 in the morning. "What kind of place is it?" I asked. "The kind that doesn't ask a lot of questions," Harlan said. I looked out the window at the Austin skyline and felt something cold and quiet begin to settle in my chest. The silence after Harlan's last words filled the room completely. The photograph of Diana was still on top of the report, that small paper bag pressed close to her side, oversized sunglasses on despite the gray morning sky. I had been staring at it long enough that it had stopped being a photograph and become something else, a feeling, the outline of something I did not want to be true. "There's more," Harlan said. He set 3 additional pages on the desk, one at a time. The first was a summary from a pharmacological consultant he had retained. The substance Diana had been purchasing was a compounded formulation not available over the counter, not traceable through standard prescription databases. In low, consistent doses, over an extended period, the consultant noted it could produce confusion, memory disruption, and a gradual erosion of sound judgment. I read that paragraph twice. How long, I asked. Based on the behavioral patterns you described, the repeated questions, the disorientation, the wrong name, the consultant believes this has been ongoing for 18 months to 2 years. 2 years. I set the page down carefully. 2 years meant this had started long before I left River Oaks. It meant that the distance I had seen in my father in those final months, the flatness in his eyes, the way he looked through me instead of at me, had not been indifference. It had been something being done to him deliberately, by the woman standing behind him, with that patient smile. All this time, I had blamed him for choosing her over me, and all this time, he may not have been choosing anything at all. I pressed my fingers flat against the desk and breathed. The second document was a timeline Diana's pharmacy visits, cross-referenced against dates, on which Harrison had made significant legal and financial decisions. Board restructuring, changes to personal investment accounts, amendments to documents executed without his long-standing legal team. The third page was a photograph. Harrison seated across from an unfamiliar financial advisor in a private dining room. His posture was slumped in a way I had never seen on him. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who could not remember exactly why. I closed the folder. The anger was there, steady and low, the kind that burns without going out, but heavier than it was grief. The particular grief of understanding that the person you had been losing was not lost the way you thought. I want to go to the FBI, I said. Harlan nodded. That's the right instinct. But what we have right now is not enough. A consultant's analysis, a timeline of pharmacy visits, financial decisions that could be explained other ways, a federal investigation needs more than a pattern. It needs documentation that is airtight. How much more? Direct evidence of the substance being administered. Financial records showing asset transfers that cannot be attributed to legitimate decisions. This will take time, Ms. Caldwell. How much time? Weeks, maybe longer. I want to bring in a financial forensics specialist and expand the scope of observation, Diana's movements, her outside contacts, anyone she meets regularly beyond the household. I agreed to everything. By the time Harlan packed up and stood to leave, the afternoon light had shifted and my coffee had gone cold. I walked him to the door and watched him cross the open floor toward the elevators. Rachel was at her desk, just outside, working through a backlog of correspondence she had been chipping away at all week. She glanced up as Harlan passed and gave him a pleasant, professional nod. I was about to step back inside when she looked over at me. Hey, she said, with the careful attentiveness that meant she had noticed something worth mentioning. I didn't want to interrupt while you had someone in, but there's been a man standing on the sidewalk across the street since early this morning. I noticed him when I came in at 8. He was still there when I went down for coffee around 10. I moved to the window and looked down. He was there. Average build, dark jacket, hands in his pockets. The kind of person designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away. He was not looking up at the building. He was watching the entrance. Did he approach anyone? I asked. Not that I saw, Rachel said. He just stands there. I stepped back from the window. Outside East 6th Street moved on at its ordinary pace. Traffic, pedestrians, the unremarkable rhythm of a weekday afternoon, and one man standing perfectly still in the middle of all of it, with his eyes fixed on my front door. I did not sleep much that night. By 7 the next morning, I was back at my desk, and by 8, I had made 3 phone calls, one to Harlan, one to our corporate attorney, and one to a cybersecurity firm in Austin that our attorney had used twice before and trusted completely. A consultant named Davis arrived before lunch. He was methodical and unhurried in the way that people who are very good at finding things tend to be, and he did not make small talk. He set up his equipment in the server room off the main corridor and told me he would need the rest of the day. I gave him whatever he needed. While Davis worked, I tried to focus on the ordinary business of running a company. There were vendor calls to return a project update from our Panhandle site, a contract revision that needed my signature before end of week. I worked through all of it with the surface part of my brain, while the rest of it stayed fixed on the man in the dark jacket who had stood outside my building the day before. By the time I went down to check at noon, he was gone. The sidewalk was empty and unremarkable, which somehow did not make me feel better. Davis came to my office at 4:30. He sat down across from me, opened his laptop, and turned the screen so I could see it. What he showed me was not dramatic. A series of access logs, timestamps, a pattern of external connection attempts that he walked me through with quiet precision. Someone had been attempting to reach our internal communication system from outside the building. Not crudely, this was not the kind of opportunistic intrusion that flagged itself immediately. It was patient and careful, the kind of access attempt designed to look like routine network noise unless you knew what to look for. How long has this been happening? I asked. Based on what I can see in the logs, at least 6 weeks, Davis said. Possibly longer if earlier records were cleared. Were they successful? He paused for a beat. On 3 occasions, yes. Internal correspondence was accessed. I can't tell you with certainty what was read, but the access points suggest someone was targeting executive-level communications. I kept my expression neutral. The entry points are all external, Davis continued. Whoever did this was working from outside your network, sophisticated enough to route through multiple servers to obscure the origin. This is not an amateur operation. He spent the following 2 hours walking me and our IT director through a complete overhaul of our access protocols, new authentication requirements, encrypted communication channels for anything sensitive, restrictions on remote access that would have seemed excessive a week ago and now felt barely sufficient. By the time he finished, the office had emptied out and the cleaning crew was making its first pass through the hallway. I thanked Davis, signed his engagement letter, and walked him out. On the way back through the parking structure beneath the building, I stopped at my car. It was a habit I had developed in the past week, without fully acknowledging it, a quick visual check before I got in something I had started doing without giving myself permission to think too hard about why. That evening, the habit paid off. I crouched down beside the rear bumper and found it almost immediately, a small magnetic device, matte black, no larger than a matchbox, pressed flat against the inside of the wheel well where it would not be visible from any normal angle. I did not touch it. I straightened up slowly, looked around the parking structure, the low hum of ventilation, the distant sound of the elevator, nobody in sight, and then I took out my phone and called Harlan. He was there within the hour. He documented everything carefully, then removed the device and bagged it. He told me it was a commercially available model, the kind that could be purchased without much difficulty, but that the placement showed someone who knew what they were doing. He told me he would trace it as far as he could. Whoever is watching you, Harlan said, standing in the pale light of the parking structure, is not being careless about it. I drove home a different route that night, then a different one again. I sat in my apartment in the dark for a while, not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, but because I needed to think clearly, and sometimes clarity requires stillness. I had been in my apartment for about an hour when my phone rang. The number on the screen was not in my contacts, a Houston area code, but not one I recognized. I stared at it through 2 full rings. Something made me answer. Serena. The voice on the other end was male low and unmistakably familiar, in the way that a voice can be when you have not heard it in years, but your memory holds on to it anyway. It's Brandon. Brandon Caldwell. I said nothing for a moment. Diana's son. The man I had spent the better part of 3 years thinking of as the person who had helped take everything from me. He was calling me at 9:47 on a Tuesday evening from a number I did not have, with a voice that sounded less like the confident stepbrother I remembered and more like someone who had not been sleeping well either. I know you have no reason to trust me, he said, but I need to talk to you, in person, as soon as possible. The ventilation system in my apartment hummed softly. Outside, Austin moved on at its usual unhurried pace. I did not hang up. I got there first. That was intentional. I wanted to be seated and oriented before Brandon walked in to have a moment to read the room, to choose a table with a clear line of sight to the entrance to be the one watching rather than the one being watched. Old habits from 3 years of learning to be careful. The place was a small coffee shop in a quiet pocket of Cedar Park, a suburb on the northern edge of Austin, the kind of neighborhood where nobody knew anybody else's last name, and a conversation in a corner booth attracted no particular attention. I had chosen it for exactly those reasons. I ordered a black coffee I did not intend to drink much of and settled in to wait. Brandon arrived 7 minutes late. I would not have recognized him immediately on the street. The Brandon Caldwell I remembered from River Oaks had been polished in the particular way of men who grow up with money and learn early that appearance is a form of currency. The man who pushed through the door that morning looked like someone who had stopped investing in that currency recently. He was thinner than I remembered. His jacket was creased. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many nights running the same thoughts in circles without resolution. He spotted me and crossed the room without looking around, which told me he was either genuinely unconcerned about being seen or too preoccupied to think about it. He slid into the seat across from me and set his hands flat on the table. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I haven't decided what this is yet," I said. "Talk." He talked. It had started. He told me about 4 months ago. He had been staying at the River Oaks house for a few weeks while his own apartment was being renovated, and one evening he had gone into the bathroom adjacent to the guest room to look for aspirin. In the back of the cabinet behind a row of his mother's things, he had found a small, unlabeled container, not a standard prescription bottle, not anything he recognized. He had taken a photograph of it on his phone and thought about it for 3 days before looking it up. What he found had kept him up for the better part of those 4 months. "I didn't want it to be what it was," he said. His voice was steady but effortful, the way a voice gets when a person has rehearsed what they want to say, but the weight of it still catches them off guard. I kept telling myself there was another explanation, that it was something for her, that I had misread the situation. "But you hadn't," I said. "No." He looked down at the table. "I hadn't." He described the changes in Harrison, and they matched with a precision that was difficult to sit with everything Harlan had already documented. The repetition, the confusion, the way Harrison would sometimes look around a familiar room as though he was trying to place it. Brandon had watched it happen gradually and told himself it was age, told himself it was stress, told himself every comfortable thing there was to tell himself until he ran out of comfortable things. "I want you to understand something," he said, and now he looked up and met my eyes directly for the first time. "I am not a good person in this story. I knew something was wrong and I did not act. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I didn't have enough information, that getting involved would only make things worse. Those were excuses. I was scared of her, Serena. I have been scared of her for a long time." I looked at him for a moment. There was something in the plainness of the admission that was harder to dismiss than a more polished version would have been. "What changed?" I asked. 2 weeks ago, Harrison asked me who I was." Brandon's jaw tightened briefly. "We were having breakfast. He looked at me across the table and asked me who I was. He recovered quickly, laughed it off, said he was still half asleep. But I saw his face in the moment before he recovered, and I knew." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a small USB drive on the table between us. "Matte gray, no markings. I've been documenting what I could for the past 3 months," he said. "Dates, observations, the photograph of the container. There are also some financial records. I was able to access transfers that don't correspond to anything on the legitimate Caldwell Energy books. It's not everything, but it's a start." I looked at the drive without touching it. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not take this to an attorney, to the police?" "Because you have the most reason to fight for him," Brandon said quietly. "And because I think you already know more than I do. I think you've been looking into this longer than I have. And I think that whatever you're building toward, whatever you're planning, you're going to need this." I picked up the drive. I was back at the Apex offices by early afternoon. Rachel was in a client call when I came through, and the open floor was quieter than usual. Half the team out at a site visit in Round Rock. I went directly to my office, closed the door, and plugged the drive into my laptop. The folder opened. I stared at the screen. Empty. Every file, every folder, gone. Not just deleted in the ordinary sense, but wiped in the thorough way that leaves no recoverable trace. The kind of erasure that requires deliberate effort and at least a basic understanding of how file systems work. I pulled the drive out and turned it over in my fingers. Brandon had handed this to me less than 2 hours ago. Between that coffee shop in Cedar Park and this office, the drive had not left my possession. It had been in my jacket pocket the entire drive back, which meant the files had been on it when he gave it to me, which meant someone had accessed it here. I sat very still for a long moment, looking at the empty screen. The office around me was familiar in every detail. The layout I had chosen, myself, the people I had hired, the building I had spent 3 years making into something I trusted. I looked at the closed door of my office, and then at the window beside my desk, and then at the drive still resting in my palm. I did not know who had done this. I did not know when or exactly how. What I knew was that someone in this building had known I was carrying that drive before I had told a single person. And that was a very specific kind of problem. Some decisions make themselves. I had spent the drive, back from Cedar Park, telling myself I needed more time, more information, more certainty, a cleaner picture before I took anything to anyone official. The empty USB drive sitting on my desk had ended that conversation. Waiting had stopped being a strategy. It had become a liability. I called Harlan that evening and told him what had happened with the drive. He listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, and then said what I had already concluded myself. "You need federal involvement," he said. Now, I called our corporate attorney first thing the following morning and asked for the best contact he had at the FBI's Houston field office. He gave me a name within the hour. I made the call myself, identified who I was and what I was dealing with in broad terms, and had a confirmed appointment by the end of the day. I drove to Houston 2 mornings later. The FBI's Houston field office sat in a federal building off West Loop South, unremarkable from the outside, which I had come to understand was something of a theme with institutions that held real authority. I was escorted through security by a front desk officer and led to a conference room on the 4th floor, where I waited for approximately 8 minutes before the door opened. The agent who walked in was a woman in her early 40s, trim and composed, with dark hair, pulled back, and the particular quality of stillness that I had come to associate with people who spent their professional lives listening carefully to what others said, and more carefully to what they did not. She introduced herself as Special Agent Sarah and shook my hand with a brief, firm grip before taking the seat across from me and opening a notepad. "Ms. Caldwell," she said, "walk me through it from the beginning." So I did. I had prepared for this the way I prepared for any significant presentation, methodically, without embellishment, in the order that made the logic clearest. I started with Harrison's behavioral changes. I moved to Harlan's surveillance, the pharmacy visits, the pharmacological consultant's findings. I laid out the financial timeline, the board restructuring the account changes the amendments executed, without his established legal team. I told her about the external intrusion into our communications system, the tracking device found on my vehicle, and Brandon's account of what he had witnessed inside the River Oaks house. I did not tell her about the USB drive. That particular detail I was still turning over, carefully, unwilling to introduce a complication I did not yet understand into a conversation I needed to go cleanly. Agent Sarah did not interrupt. She wrote steadily throughout, and when I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me for a moment in the way that people do when they are organizing a significant amount of information. "How long have you been gathering this independently?" she asked. "Actively about 6 weeks," I said. "Passively watching, noticing considerably longer." She nodded slowly. "The pharmacological evidence is the most significant piece you have. Combined with the financial irregularities and the pattern of behavioral change, this is enough to open a preliminary inquiry." She paused. I want to be direct with you, Miss Caldwell. Opening an inquiry and building a case are different things. What you have given me today establishes that something is wrong. To prosecute, we need documentation of the specific substance, confirmed chain of administration, and financial records that can withstand scrutiny in a federal courtroom. Harlan can continue to gather on the ground, I said. I'll want to speak with him directly, she said. And I'll need everything you've described today in writing a formal statement supported by copies of whatever documentation you can provide. She turned a page in her notepad. I'd also recommend you say nothing to anyone in your immediate circle about this meeting or its outcome. The external access to your communications suggests someone is actively monitoring your movements. The fewer people who know, the better positioned we are. Understood, I said. Give us 2 weeks, Agent Sarah said. I'll have a clearer picture of what federal resources we can bring in and what the next steps look like operationally. In the meantime, keep your head down and keep Harlan close. We spent another 30 minutes going through specifics, what I would provide in writing, how Harlan would make contact with her office, the secure channel she would use to reach me going forward. When it was over, she stood and shook my hand again, and there was something in the steadiness of her expression that was, if not reassuring, exactly, at least solid, something to put weight on. I drove back to Austin in the early afternoon with the windows down and the radio off, thinking about 2 weeks and what I needed to do inside them. I pulled into the Apex parking structure a little before 4 and took the elevator up to the main floor. The office was mid-afternoon, busy phones, keyboards, the low hum of a building full of people doing their work. Rachel was at her desk outside my office, walking someone through what sounded like a scheduling conflict on the phone. 2 of our project managers were in a discussion by the window. The junior analyst near the back had headphones in and was deep in a spreadsheet. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment and looked at all of it. There was nothing wrong with the picture in front of me. No detail out of place, no behavior that would have drawn a second glance on any other afternoon. The people in this room were people I had hired, people I had worked alongside for years, people I had trusted with the daily operations of a company I had built from nothing. And yet, something sat just beneath the surface of the ordinary, shapeless, and specific at the same time, the way a sound is when you are not quite sure you heard it. I could not name it. I could not point to it. It was not fear exactly, and it was not suspicion of any particular person or thing. It was the feeling of a room that looked exactly right and somehow was not. I walked to my office, closed the door quietly behind me, and sat down at my desk. Outside the glass, the afternoon carried on without interruption, and somewhere underneath the ordinary rhythm of it, something I could not identify continued to pull very softly at the edges of my attention. 14 days sounds like a long time until you are living inside them. The 2 weeks that followed my meeting in Houston were the most deliberately structured of my life. I had always been organized. Running Apex had required a level of operational precision that I had developed out of necessity, but this was different. This was not managing a company. This was managing a single moment that everything else had been building toward, and there was no margin for anything to go wrong. I broke the 14 days into segments and worked backward from the morning of the press conference. Every decision, every preparation, every conversation was mapped against that fixed point on the calendar, like coordinates on a grid. The venue came first. The Four Seasons in downtown Houston was the right choice for reasons that were both practical and deliberate. It had the capacity, the technical infrastructure, and the kind of institutional credibility that signals seriousness without having to announce it. More importantly, it was in Houston, my father's city, Diana's city, the city where the Caldwell name carried weight. I wanted the geography to mean something. I booked the main ballroom under a corporate events designation that gave away nothing specific. The reservation went through our external events coordinator, a detail that would matter later. The legal team came next. Our lead attorney, brought in 2 additional partners from a firm in Dallas that specialized in corporate litigation and had handled federal cooperation cases before. The 3 of them spent 4 days reviewing every piece of documentation we planned to present, cross-checking stress testing, looking for the kind of gaps that opposing counsel would find if we did not find them first. They were thorough in the particular way that makes you grateful and exhausted in equal measure. Agent Sarah confirmed federal coordination on day 6. She did not give me details I did not need, which I had come to understand was her way of keeping the operation clean on both sides. What she told me was that her team would be in position and that the timing we had agreed on would hold. That was enough. The communications strategy took the better part of 3 days. A public relations director named Vivian, a composed, razor-sharp woman who had managed disclosures for 2 Fortune 500 companies through federal investigations, came in and rebuilt our entire approach from the ground up. She rewrote my opening statement 4 times. The 4th version was the one that was true and precise and said exactly what needed to be said without a single unnecessary word. I practiced it until I could deliver it without looking at the page. Vivian ran me through simulated questions, aggressive ones, skeptical ones, the kind designed to make you stumble, or qualify, or retreat. I stumbled twice in the first session. I did not stumble in the second. By the 3rd session, I had stopped thinking about the words and started thinking about the room, which Vivian told me was exactly where I needed to be. "You're not delivering information," she said during one of our late evening sessions in the Apex conference room. "You're establishing reality. There's a difference." I wrote that down. By day 10, the pieces had locked into place with a precision that was almost unsettling. The venue was confirmed, the legal documentation was finalized, the federal coordination was active, the communications strategy was set. Rachel had managed the logistical coordination of it all, scheduling travel arrangements, room bookings in Houston for the legal team, with the seamless efficiency that had made her indispensable from the beginning. She asked no questions about the substance of what was being prepared, which I had come to understand was one of the things that made her exceptional at her job. Harlan checked in on day 11 with a brief update. Diana's patterns had not changed. Harrison's condition appeared stable. No new developments on the external surveillance front. Steady and unremarkable, which under the circumstances was the best news I could have received. On day 12, I drove to Houston and spent 2 hours in the Four Seasons Ballroom with our technical team walking through sightlines, microphone placement, the positioning of the display screens we would use to present the documentation. I stood at the podium in an empty room and looked out at the rows of chairs arranged for a press corps that did not yet know it would be there. And I thought about my father in a hospital bed I had not yet seen, and about my mother's handwriting on the confidentiality agreement she had structured 3 years ago to give me exactly enough time to become someone who could stand in a room like this and not flinch. I did not flinch. Day 13 was quiet by design. I had deliberately kept it clear. No meetings, no calls that were not essential, nothing that would fragment my focus on the 24 hours ahead. I worked from home in the morning, went through the opening statement one final time, and drove to the office in the early afternoon to collect the last set of documents the legal team had prepared. By 9 that evening, I was back in my apartment. Everything that could be done had been done. The pieces were in place. The people were in position. The morning was 11 hours away. I was in the middle of a response to a routine vendor email when the notification appeared in the corner of my screen. A new message in the private inbox I used for sensitive communications, an account known to fewer than a dozen people. The sender field was blank. No name, no address, just an empty line where an identity should have been. I opened it. 4 words. That was all. "They know everything. Check your assistant." I read it twice. Then I set my hands flat on the desk on either side of the keyboard and sat very still, looking at those 4 words on the screen in front of me, while 11 hours quietly became something that felt much smaller. I did not call anyone first. Looking back, I understand that was not the rational choice. The rational choice would have been to call Harlan or Agent Sarah or our lead attorney and talk through what the email meant before doing anything. But rationality requires a kind of distance that I did not have in that moment. And some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years watching and waiting and measuring every move, already knew. I drove to the office in 18 minutes. The Apex building, after hours, had a particular quality of stillness. The lobby lit on low. The elevator hum, the only sound. The open floor dark, except for the glow of standby screens along the far wall. I had called ahead to the overnight security desk and asked them to confirm that Rachel's access card had been used within the last 2 hours. It had. She was still in the building. I found her in the small records room off the main corridor, a narrow space lined with filing cabinets, and a single workstation, the kind of room that nobody used after 6, unless they needed to be somewhere that was not easily observed. She was seated at the workstation, with her back to the door. She did not hear me come in. "Rachel," I said. She turned, and in the half-second before her expression arranged itself, I saw something move across her face. Not guilt exactly, but the recognition of a situation that had just changed. The recognition of someone who has been found. I set my phone on the filing cabinet beside me, the email still open on the screen. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. She looked at the phone, then she looked at me. Then she sat back in her chair slowly, like someone releasing a breath they had been holding for a very long time. "How long?" I asked. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. "Since before I interviewed," she said. The words landed with a specific kind of weight, not the shock of something unexpected, but the particular heaviness of a thing you half knew being confirmed out loud. Since before she interviewed, which meant the woman I had hired on the spot for the quality of her attention, for the way she listened, like it personally mattered that quality had been practiced, directed. It had been pointed at me from the very beginning. "Diana approached you," I said. "Her attorney did," Rachel said. 3 weeks before I applied. They knew the position was opening. I don't know how. They knew what you were looking for. They coached me on what to say." She paused. "I needed the money. I'm not going to tell you that makes it all right, because I know it doesn't. But that was why." I kept my voice very even. "What did you give them?" She told me, methodically, and without embellishment, the way someone talks when they have decided that the only thing left is to be accurate. Scheduling information, meeting summaries, the contents of communications she had accessed through her administrative credentials, the details of the FBI meeting, not everything, but enough, the logistics of the press conference, the name of the venue, the date and time, and the USB drive. When I had come back from Cedar Park with it in my jacket pocket, she had been in my office returning a document to my desk. She had seen the drive. She had accessed it while I was in the restroom down the hall. "The video," I said. "Tell me about the video." Rachel looked at her hands. "Diana hired someone to produce it. A fabricated recording made to look like you, accepting an arrangement from a foreign investment group in exchange for regulatory assistance. It was designed to discredit you before you could speak publicly." She paused. "It's scheduled to go out through an automated distribution system at 6 o'clock this morning, pushed to media contacts and online platforms simultaneously." "Who built it?" I asked. "Who runs the distribution?" She gave me a name, a technical contractor based in Dallas. She gave me the name of the distribution service, a commercial media release platform that had no knowledge of the content it was carrying. I picked up my phone. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "The man who was watching your building," she said quietly. "That was also Diana. He was there to confirm you were following your normal patterns. I told them when you changed your routine." I looked at her for a long moment. There was anger. There was a great deal of anger. But underneath it was something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of understanding that the person you trusted most completely had been from the very first day reading your mail and reporting back. I called building security. and asked them to send 2 officers to the records room. Then I called Harlan. While I waited, I walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at Austin. Below the city lights, steady and indifferent. The streets quiet. At this hour, the world entirely unaware that somewhere in it a clock was running. The security officers arrived 4 minutes later. I watched them escort Rachel out of the records room and toward the elevator, and I thought about 18 months of early mornings and late evenings, and every conversation I had trusted her to hold carefully. Then I stopped thinking about it. There was no time. I looked at my watch. 11:23. No, I looked again. 23:15. 6 hours and 45 minutes. The first call took 40 seconds. I was already moving when I dialed down the corridor, past the empty workstations, into my office, where the full documentation was stored. Agent Sarah picked up on the second ring, which told me she had not been asleep, or had not been sleeping in any meaningful way, the way people do not sleep the night before something they have spent 2 weeks preparing for. I gave her everything in under a minute. The distribution platform Rachel had named, the technical contractor in Dallas, the 6 o'clock window. I heard her writing as I spoke, the scratch of pen on paper, fast and continuous. And when I finished, she asked 2 questions, both precise, both focused on the technical specifics, and then she said, "Stay where you are. I'm making calls." The line went quiet. I sat down at my desk and looked at the clock on my computer screen. 23:20. 6 hours and 40 minutes. The FBI's Technical Response Unit operated out of the Houston field office, but the agents who handled digital forensics and network interdiction were reachable around the clock for exactly this kind of situation. Agent Sarah had them on the line within 7 minutes of hanging up with me. She called me back at 23:32 to tell me they were already working cross-referencing the distribution platform Rachel had named against known commercial immediate release services, attempting to identify the specific account and scheduled release tied to the fabricated recording. "The contractor name helps," she said. "If he used his own credentials and anywhere in the setup, we'll find the thread." "And if he didn't?" I asked. A pause. "Not long. Then we work the platform directly. It takes longer, but it's not impossible. We have time." She said it steadily, the way she said most things. I did not ask her to say it again, but I held on to it. I had one more call to make. Brandon picked up on the third ring, his voice carrying the particular roughness of someone pulled out of a light in troubled sleep. I told him what had happened in as few words as possible. Rachel, the recording, the 6 o'clock deadline. I told him I needed him. Diana's financial accounts, I said. Her external ones, the ones she uses outside the household. If the contractor was paid to produce this, there will be a transaction. Agent Sarah's team needs something to anchor the trail on their end. You're the only person who might know where to look. A silence on the line. Not hesitation processing. I know where she keeps records, Brandon said. Physical ones at the house. I know the account names she uses. Another pause. I'm getting in the car. Brandon, it's nearly midnight. Houston is 3 hours. Then I'll be there by 3, he said, and hung up. I set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of my office. Outside the windows, Austin was dark and unhurried, entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere in a server room I had never seen a piece of fabricated footage, was sitting in a scheduled queue waiting for daylight. The next 2.5 hours were the strangest of my life. There was nothing for me to do but wait and stay available, which is a particular kind of difficult when every instinct is telling you to move. I made coffee. I did not drink. I went through the press conference documentation one more time, not because anything needed changing, but because having something to look at helped. I called Harlan at midnight and gave him a full briefing. He listened without interrupting, and then said he would position himself near the River Oaks estate before dawn, in case the situation required a physical presence there. Agent Sarah checked in at 12:45. Her team had identified the distribution platform account. They were working through the verification process required to compel the platform to release account information, a process that had legal requirements even under federal authority even at 12:45 in the morning. How long, I asked. 45 minutes to an hour for the legal authorization. Then we go directly to their emergency compliance team. I kept working through the numbers in my head. 12:45 plus 45 minutes put us at 1:30. Legal authorization plus compliance, contact plus technical action. The margins were shrinking, but they were not gone. Not yet. Brandon arrived at 2:58. I heard the elevator before I saw him, the soft mechanical sound of it reaching the floor, the doors parting. He came through the entrance of the open floor in a jacket he had clearly grabbed off a hook on his way out the door, carrying a worn leather portfolio that looked like it had not been opened in some time. He sat down across from me at the conference table and opened the portfolio without preamble. 3 accounts, he said. 1 in her name, 2 under LLCs she set up in Nevada about 4 years ago. I don't have the full numbers, but I have the institution names and the approximate registration dates. He spread 3 handwritten pages across the table. If your agent can work with this, she can, I said. I photographed the pages and sent them through the secure channel Agent Sarah had established. Her acknowledgement came back in 4 minutes. We sat across from each other at the conference table, Brandon and I in the strange, compressed quiet of 2:45 in the morning, and did not talk about the things that were too large to talk about. We talked about logistics, about timing, about what the next 3 hours needed to look like. At 3:12, Agent Sarah called. We found the server, she said. The account is confirmed, the scheduled release is identified. We have eyes on it. A brief pause. We need approximately 1 more hour to complete the interdiction, without triggering a backup release protocol the contractor built into the system. If we move before we're ready, it redistributes automatically to a secondary list. 1 hour. I looked at the clock. 3:12. 1 hour put us at 4:12. The release window was 6 o'clock. 1 hour, 48 minutes of margin if nothing else went wrong. Take the hour, I said. Do it right. That's the plan, Agent Sarah said. I set the phone down on the conference table. Brandon was looking at me from across, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. Well, he said. They found it, I said. They need 1 more hour. He nodded slowly and looked down at the table. 1 more hour. Outside, Austin held its breath. The hour between 3 and 4 in the morning is the one that tells you who you are. Not in the dramatic sense, not in the sense of crisis or confrontation, or the kind of moment that announces itself. In the quiet sense, the sense of sitting in a room with bad coffee and someone you did not expect to trust, waiting for news you cannot control, and discovering what your mind does when there is nothing left to do but let it run. Brandon had fallen asleep in the chair across from me, somewhere around 3:30, not deeply, his arms folded and his head at an angle that would leave him stiff in the morning, but asleep. I had let him. He had driven 3 hours in the middle of the night and handed me the thread that had made this possible. He had earned the 30 minutes. I did not sleep. I sat at the conference table with my mother's letter open on my phone, the one Edward Marsh had read to me in his office 3 years ago, the one I had photographed and kept in a folder I returned to when I needed to remember why any of this was worth the cost. Let her find her footing first. Let her become who she was always meant to be before the world finds out. I had read it so many times. The words had stopped being words and become something else, a rhythm, a hand on my shoulder in a quiet room. At 4:12, Agent Sarah sent a brief message through the secure channel. Interdiction proceeding. On schedule. Maintain position. I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling and breathed. 4:12. 1 hour, 48 minutes to the release window. The math still worked. Barely, but it worked. Brandon stirred at 4:45, straightened in his chair, and looked at me with the slightly disoriented expression of someone remembering where they were and why. Anything, he asked. On schedule, I said. He nodded and reached for his cold coffee and drank it anyway, which I found oddly steadying. We did not talk much after that. There was a particular companionship in the silence, not comfortable exactly, but honest. Two people who had arrived at the same table from very different directions, held there by the same weight. The call came at 5:30, not from Agent Sarah, from a number I recognized immediately, Houston Methodist Hospital, the main line. My stomach dropped before I had finished reading the screen. I answered. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, a night shift physician who introduced herself and then told me in the measured cadence of someone trained to deliver difficult information without amplifying panic that Harrison Caldwell had been brought in approximately 40 minutes earlier. Chest irregularities. They were running tests. His condition at present was stable, not critical, not deteriorating, but requiring monitoring and evaluation. Is he conscious? I asked. He is, she said. He's been asking for you. I stood up from the conference table. Brandon was watching me alert now, reading my face. I pressed my hand flat against the window and looked out at the city, the first pale suggestion of morning just beginning to show. At the edges of the sky, the streets below still dark and quiet. My father was in a hospital bed 3 hours away asking for me, and in 80 minutes, something we had spent weeks building would either succeed or fall apart in a way that could not be undone. I stood at that window for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Miss Caldwell, the physician said. I'm here, I said. Please tell him I know. Tell him I'm coming, but I need a few hours. Tell him I stopped. Started again. Tell him I'm finishing something. He'll understand. I did not know if that was true, but I said it. I ended the call and turned back to the room. Brandon had not moved. My father, I said. He's stable. Houston Methodist. Something shifted in Brandon's expression, something that had nothing to do with strategy or logistics. He looked at his hands for a moment. Go, he said quietly. I can stay here and— No, I said. Not yet. I need to see this through. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded once. No argument, no qualification. Just the nod of someone who understood that there are decisions a person has to make for themselves, and the only respectful thing to do is let them. I sat back down. At 5:41, I sent Agent Sarah a message. Hospital called. Harrison stable. I'm staying. What's your status? Her response came in 90 seconds. Final sequence initiated. 6 minutes. I set the phone face up on the table in front of me and watched the screen. Brandon watched it with me. 5:43, 5:45, 5:48. At 5:50, the phone lit up. Done. Release neutralized. Secondary protocol did not activate. You're clear. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down very carefully. The way you set something down, when your hands are not entirely steady. And I looked across the table at Brandon, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. It worked, I said finally. Not loudly. Just the two words in the quiet of a room that had held a very long night. Brandon exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I stood up. There was a spare set of clothes in the bag I kept in my office for long travel days, a habit developed from too many early flights and last-minute schedule changes. I went and got the bag, and when I came back, Brandon was standing at the window, looking out at the morning. The sky had shifted while we were not watching. The darkness had pulled back from the east, leaving something pale and quiet in its place, not quite sunrise yet, but the honest, unhurried light that comes before it. The city below was beginning to stir. The first cars, the first pedestrians. I checked the time. 5:55. The press conference was at 9. 3 hours. I picked up my bag and looked at Brandon one last time. Thank you, I said. And I meant it in all the ways there were to mean it. He gave me a small, tired, genuine smile, the first real one I had seen from him, and said, Go finish it. I walked out of the conference room, down the corridor, and through the lobby of a building that had been mine for 3 years, and felt, for the first time, entirely like it. I had imagined this moment many times. Not the details, not the specific light of the Four Seasons ballroom, or the particular sound of 100 conversations, stopping when I walked through the door, but the feeling of it, the feeling of walking into a room that had been built for this, and knowing that you were the reason it existed. I had imagined it during the long nights at Apex, during the drives between Austin and Houston, during the hours in Edward Marsh's conference room, when everything had been paperwork and patience and the discipline of not moving before the time was right. The reality was both smaller and larger than I had imagined, the way important things tend to be. The ballroom of the Four Seasons on Lamar Street was set for a full press conference. Rows of chairs, camera positions along the back wall, a podium at the front with the Apex Renewable Energy logo displayed on the screen behind it. The room was already full when I arrived. Houston Press Energy Industry Media, two network affiliates whose satellite trucks I had seen parked on the street outside. Vivian, our communications director, met me at the side entrance and walked me through the logistics in a low, efficient voice. Timing order of speakers, the position of the legal team, without once commenting on the fact that I was wearing the same clothes I had put on yesterday and had not slept in approximately 22 hours. That was why I had hired her. 2 minutes, she said, and peeled off toward the front of the room. I stood in the side corridor and looked at the closed door that led to the stage. My hands were not entirely steady. I noticed this the way you notice weather, as a fact about the present moment, neither alarming nor surprising. I had earned the unsteady hands. What mattered was that everything above them was clear. I pushed the door open and walked to the podium. The room shifted when I appeared, not loudly, but perceptibly, the way a room shifts when the person everyone has been waiting for arrives. I set my notes on the podium surface and looked out at the assembled press corps and did not rush. My name is Serena Caldwell, I said. I am the majority owner and chief executive of Apex Renewable Energy, based in Austin, Texas. Most of you have not heard of me before today. That was intentional. It is no longer necessary. I spoke for 11 minutes. I told them about Apex, its founding, its growth, the $800 million energy agreement with the state of Texas that would be formally executed within the week. I told them about my mother, Margaret Caldwell, who had built the foundation of this company in quiet and left it to me with the instruction to find my footing before the world found out. I told them about my father, Harrison Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Energy, a man I loved and had spent 3 years fighting to protect. And then I told them about Diana. I did not editorialize. I did not use language that was larger than the facts required. I presented the pharmacological evidence, the compounded formulation, the documented pattern of administration, the consultant's findings regarding the neurological effects on a person of Harrison's age and profile. I presented the financial timeline, the board restructuring the account amendments, the transfers that the forensic specialist had traced to external accounts in Diana's name. I presented the documentation of the external surveillance on Apex, the network intrusion, the tracking device the individual Diana had positioned to monitor my movements. The legal team had the supporting documentation packaged and distributed to every seat in the room before I reached the third section of my statement. I finished speaking. For approximately 2 seconds, the room was completely silent. Then it was not. The questions began immediately, overlapping, urgent. The particular energy of a room full of journalists who understand they are in the middle of something significant. I answered 4 of them clearly and briefly before Vivian stepped to the microphone and indicated that a full documentation package was available and that additional questions would be taken through official channels. It was at that moment, in the controlled near chaos of cameras and voices and the legal team moving through the room, that the side door opened. Agent Sarah came in first, followed by 3 federal officers. They moved through the room with the particular efficiency of people who have done this before and have no interest in theater. Diana was seated in the 4th row, where Vivian had placed her under the pretense of a courtesy media invitation, a detail I had approved and that had required more nerve to arrange than almost anything else in the past 2 weeks. Diana did not stand when they approached. She sat very still in the composed and deliberate way she had always managed difficult moments, as though stillness itself were a form of control. One of the officers spoke to her in a low voice. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and rose. She turned as she did. And for a moment, just one, her eyes found mine across the room. I have thought about that look many times since. There was no rage in it, no pleading, nothing theatrical. It was something quieter and more specific than any of that. It was the look of a person who had spent years calculating outcomes and had, for the first time, miscalculated entirely. Recognition, without concession. The acknowledgement of a move she had not seen coming from a direction she had not thought to watch. Then she looked away. The officers guided her through the side door. The room absorbed it. Cameras, turning voices rising, and the press conference completed its transformation from announcement to event. I stood at the podium for another moment. Then I stepped back, handed my notes to Vivian, and walked out the way I had come in. Outside on Lamar Street, Houston moved at its ordinary mid-morning pace. The satellite trucks were still there. A small cluster of people had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the activity. The July heat was already building the air, thick and bright, in the way of Houston summers that do not apologize for themselves. I found my car in the parking structure, got in, and sat for exactly 1 minute. Then I pulled out of the garage and pointed the car north on Interstate 45 toward Houston Methodist Hospital, toward a man in a hospital bed who had asked for me and whom I had told to wait. He had waited long enough. I stood outside the door for longer than I needed to. Room 214, Houston Methodist. The hallway around me had the quiet of hospital midday, unhurried footsteps, the distant sound of a cart, the low hum of a building that never fully stops. I had driven 3 hours to be here. I had stood at a podium and said everything that needed saying. I had watched Diana be guided out of that ballroom without looking away. Standing in front of room 214, I could not make myself reach for the handle. It took me another minute. Then I pushed the door open and went in. The room was quiet and cool, the blinds half drawn against the afternoon sun. Monitoring equipment to the left, a plastic pitcher of water on the side table untouched, the television off, and my father in the bed. Harrison Caldwell had always been a large presence, the kind of man who occupied a room fully, whose voice carried whom people oriented toward when he entered a space. In that bed, with monitoring leads visible at his collar and a thin blanket pulled to his waist, he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with illness. He looked like a man, just a man older than I had been letting myself acknowledge, with gray at his temples that had not been there 3 years ago. He was awake. His eyes found me the moment I stepped through the door, and something in them shifted. Not surprise, because the hospital had told him I was coming, but the particular settling of something that has been waiting and no longer has to. "Serena," he said. Quieter than I remembered, rougher at the edges, but his. I crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. Neither of us spoke for a moment. There was a great deal to say, years of things unsaid, and the weight of all of it sat in the room with us like a third presence. I had thought on the drive up about what I would say first. Sitting here now, I understood why I had not arrived at an answer. There was no right first sentence. There was only the fact of being in the same room, which was more than we had managed in 3 years. Harrison lifted his hand from the blanket slowly, with the deliberate care of someone conserving effort, and held it toward me. I took it. His grip was not strong. That was new. What I held was careful and a little uncertain, but entirely present. The physician came in shortly after, a calm, methodical man who walked me through Harrison's condition in plain language. The cardiac irregularities were consistent with the prolonged effects of what had been introduced into his system. With the source removed and proper treatment begun, full recovery was expected. It would take time and follow-up care, but the trajectory was clear. He would be all right. I thanked the physician. The door swung shut behind him, and the room returned to its quiet. Harrison had not let go of my hand. "The news," he said after a while, a single nod toward the dark television screen. "One of the nurses told me." A pause. "You did that?" Yes, I said. Something moved across his face, complex and slow, the way feelings move when a person has not had full access to their own mind for a long time and is only now beginning to find their way back. Your mother, he said. She always knew what you were. I did not trust my voice entirely, so I held his hand a little more firmly and let that be the answer. We sat together while the afternoon moved outside the half-drawn blinds. It was the first time in longer than I could calculate that I had been in a room with my father and felt nothing that needed defending against. No measuring, no careful management of what I said and held back. Just quiet, just the two of us, and the monitoring unit and the ordinary sounds of the hospital going about its business. Harrison's eyes had grown heavy. The effort of the morning had cost him, and the medication was doing what medication does. His grip on my hand had softened to something barely there. Then his eyes moved, not to my face, down, to my wrist, to the old silver watch with the worn leather band and the small crack along the crystal face, the one he had given me when I turned 16, the one I had never taken off, the one I had carried out of River Oaks when I had nothing else worth carrying. Something happened in his expression, a recognition so specific and so internal that I could not read it fully, only sense its depth, the way you sense the bottom of something without being able to see it. His lips moved. I leaned forward. Dad, the words were barely sound. A breath shaped into syllables, quiet enough that the monitoring unit nearly covered them entirely. I caught perhaps half something about the watch, a word that might have been inside, and then my name again, soft and certain. Then his eyes closed. His breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep. Not the shallow drift of someone fighting consciousness, but the deep, unhurried rest of a body, finally given permission to recover. I sat beside him for a long time after that. I did not move the watch. 3 months is enough time for a city to move on. Houston is good at that, at absorbing extraordinary things into its ordinary rhythm, at filing the remarkable under things that happened, and continuing at its characteristic pace. By October, the press coverage had shifted from front pages to follow-up pieces. The Caldwell case had become a reference point rather than a headline, which is how you know a story has completed its first chapter and begun its second. I watched all of it from a careful distance. The legal proceedings against Diana moved with the deliberateness of the federal system, methodical, thorough, immune to impatience. The charges were substantial: financial fraud, unlawful administration of a controlled compound, exploitation of a vulnerable adult conspiracy. The documentation Harlan had gathered, supplemented by the forensic financial work, had constructed a case that left very little room for alternative interpretation. Diana entered a plea in late September. I was not in the courtroom. I had chosen not to be, because I understood that my presence there would have been about something other than justice, about witnessing, about satisfaction. And I did not want that to be the version of myself I brought into that room. I learned the outcome from our lead attorney, who called me on a Thursday morning and gave me the details in his measured professional tone. I thanked him and sat quietly for a few minutes. That was all. That was enough. The Apex Energy Agreement with Texas was executed formally in October. I stood at the signing table and put my name on documents representing the largest renewable energy contract in Texas history. And I thought about my mother and her quiet, patient architecture of all of this. Afterward, on the drive back to the office, I called Edward Marsh and asked him to make a donation in her name to the hospice facility where she had spent her final weeks. He said he would arrange it. I told him to make it significant. Brandon called in mid-October. He had taken a position with an environmental consulting firm in Denver, found through a contact he had made during the weeks of working alongside our legal team. We talked for 40 minutes, the longest conversation we had ever had without urgency driving it. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized we were simply talking. Two people who had arrived at an understanding through circumstances. Neither would have chosen finding the understanding, had outlasted the circumstances. Before he hung up, he said, "I'm sorry it took what it took." "So am I said. "But it got us here." The question of the Caldwell assets had been the most complicated of the 3 months. My attorneys had advised me more than once that I had grounds to pursue a legal claim, that the circumstances of my removal, conducted while Harrison was under compromised conditions, constituted grounds for remedy. Each time I declined. The Caldwell assets were my father's, the product of 30 years of his work and his life. I did not want them through a legal door. I wanted to enter what remained of my relationship with him the way I had entered room 214 at Houston Methodist, by pushing the door open myself without a brief. Harrison called on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. He sounded better, still deliberate with his words, still careful with his energy, but more himself. The physician had described his recovery as ahead of schedule. "I'd like you to come to the house," he said, "when you're ready." I asked if he was sure. "I'm sure," he said, simply, without qualification. We agreed on a Saturday. I drove down from Austin on a morning that felt like the first real day of Texas fall. The air cooled to something reasonable, the light at an angle that made everything look considered. I drove without the radio, which I had found over these months was how I did my best thinking. River Oaks was exactly as I remembered. The lawns, the mature trees, the particular quiet of a Saturday morning in a neighborhood with enough space between people to not hear each other living. I drove the familiar streets with the window down, not thinking very hard about anything. The entrance to the Caldwell estate appeared on my left, the same iron gate, the same magnolia-lined driveway, leading to the red brick facade and white columns. The gate was open. I turned in. The gravel made the sound it had always made. The magnolias had dropped leaves in the recent cooler nights, scattered along the edges of the drive, the way they always had in autumn when I was young. And this place was still a storybook, and not yet something more complicated. I pulled up in front of the steps and turned off the engine. The front door was open. Through the glass of the storm door, I could see the marble foyer, lit softly in the way of a house being lived in gently. I sat for a moment, hands in my lap, looking at the door. Then I got out. The study smelled the way it always had, old leather and cedar wood, with just a faint trace of the pipe tobacco my father had given up years ago. Some things don't leave a room even after you stop doing them. They just settle into the walls and wait. Harrison closed the door behind us. Not because there was anyone else in the house. I think it was habit, the way a man closes a door when something important is about to happen. "Sit down, sweetheart," he said. I hadn't heard that word from him in so long it almost didn't register. I sat in the chair across from his desk, the one with the cracked leather armrest that had been there since I was a child. He didn't sit behind the desk. He pulled a chair around and sat next to me, instead, close enough that our knees were almost touching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was something different about the room today. A stillness that didn't feel empty, it felt chosen, like the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the two of us to finally be in the same room without anything standing between us. Harrison reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan. His hands were steadier than they had been in the hospital, but still slower than I remembered from years ago. He set the watch on the arm of his chair. My watch, the one he had given me when I turned 16. "I asked the nurse to keep it while I was recovering," he said. "I didn't want it to get lost. I've been waiting to give it back to you properly." I looked at the watch without touching it. The silver casing was scratched in 3 places once, from when I dropped it on a driveway at 14 once, from a hiking trip in my early 20s, and once from the parking lot in Austin, on a night I would rather forget. The face was still perfect, clean and exact, the way it had always been. Harrison picked it up gently and turned it over. I had seen the back of that watch 100 times. The inscription, "For Serena, time is yours, Dad." I had read those words so many times, I had stopped seeing them years ago. But he was pressing the small latch on the lower edge, one I had never noticed, and the back panel was opening. Not the outer casing. A second compartment, thin as a playing card, built flush against the inner surface. Inside was a piece of paper folded 3 times. Old paper, the kind that had been handled carefully and stored with intention. He unfolded it with both hands and held it out to me. "Read it," he said quietly. The handwriting was his, slanted slightly to the left, the letters pressed firmly into the page, the way he always wrote when something mattered to him. At the top, a date. 14 months before the morning, he handed me that check and told me to leave. It was an amendment to his will. The language was formal. At the top, legal phrasing about the River Oaks property. The Caldwell Energy shares a series of investment accounts I hadn't known existed. All of it in the event of his passing, to go to me. Not divided, not conditional. All of it. But at the bottom of the page, below the notarized signature, there was a second section, written in different ink. Darker, more deliberate. As though he had come back to the paper later after the lawyers had gone and added something the legal language couldn't hold. She carried the watch. She will know what to do with the rest. My hands were shaking. "I wrote that the week after Diana moved in," he said. "I didn't understand what was happening to me yet. I only knew that something was wrong and that I needed to put something in writing before I lost the clarity to do it." He paused. "I hid it where I knew only you would ever look, because you were the only one who still had the watch." I couldn't speak. I was looking at the words, but they kept blurring, the ink going soft at the edges. Every time I blinked. "Serena." I looked up. Harrison's face was older than I had ever let myself see before. There were lines I didn't remember, a tiredness around the eyes that had settled in deep, but his gaze was steady, completely clear. "I never stopped loving you," he said. "Not for one single day." Something inside me that had been braced for a very long time finally let go. I don't know how long we sat there after that. Long enough for the light in the room to shift for the afternoon, to begin moving toward evening. He didn't try to explain everything. I didn't ask him to. There would be time for all of that. The questions, the accounting of years, the slow and imperfect work of finding our way back. For right now, this was enough. I folded the paper carefully and set it on the desk. Then I picked up the watch and turned it over in my hands. Once more the inscription, the scratches, the small hidden latch that I had never thought to press. I clasped it back around my wrist, and when I looked up at my father, sitting beside me, in a room that smelled of cedar and old leather and the particular quiet that only comes after something long overdue has finally been said, I smiled. Not the polite kind, not the professional kind. I had spent years perfecting in boardrooms and press conferences. The real kind, the kind that starts somewhere deep and rises slowly and doesn't ask permission. Harrison saw it, and for the first time in a very long time, so did I. The sun came up slow over Austin that morning, not the dramatic kind of sunrise that shows up in photographs, just a quiet, gradual brightening, the kind that happens whether you're watching it or not. By the time I got to the office, the sky had gone from deep gray to a pale clear gold, and the city below was just beginning to stir. I had been here since 6, not because I had to be. The signing wasn't until 9, but there was something I had always done before important days arrived early, sat in the quiet, before the world caught up, and let myself feel the weight of what was about to happen. It was a habit my mother had taught me without meaning to. She used to say that the most honest version of yourself shows up before breakfast, before the emails, before anyone else is watching. She was right about most things. The Apex offices occupied the top 2 floors of a building on East 6th Street, the same address I had stood in front of 3 years ago on a sidewalk in the August heat, reading the name on the glass for the very first time. Back then, I hadn't known what to do with my hands. I had pressed one palm flat against the wall, just to feel something solid. Today I knew exactly what to do with my hands. At 9 o'clock, the conference room filled. Legal counsel from 3 firms. Representatives from the Texas Energy Commission. 2 members of the state legislature, a notary, a photographer from the Austin business desk of the state's largest newspaper. Vivian, our communications director, standing near the door with a quietly triumphant expression she was working very hard to contain. The contract was 47 pages. I had read all of them twice, once on my own, and once aloud with our legal team the afternoon before. It was a 15-year renewable energy agreement covering wind and solar development across 6 counties in West Texas, with provisions that would bring reliable power to communities that had been working off aging infrastructure for decades. My mother had started this. She had spent 6 years building Apex from a regional consulting firm into something that could eventually land a contract like this. She never got to see it through. I signed my name on the final page at 9:22 in the morning. There was a round of applause in the room. Not the loud kind, just the professional, measured kind that people offer when something significant has been accomplished and everyone in the room is aware of it. I thanked the delegation, shook hands down the line, and said the things that needed to be said. And then when the room began to empty, and Vivian was gathering folders, and the photographer was packing his bag, I walked back to my office and closed the door. On my desk, between the monitor and the small potted succulent Rachel had left behind when she was escorted out of the building 9 months ago, I hadn't moved it for reasons I still wasn't entirely sure of. There was a frame. Inside the frame was a check, $500 made out to Serena Caldwell, dated the morning my father handed it to me in the foyer of the River Oaks house. I had never cashed it. I had folded it into my coat pocket that day without thinking and found it 3 weeks later when I was going through my things in Austin. By then, I had already decided what to do with it. I had it framed on a Tuesday afternoon alone without telling anyone. Not as bitterness, not as a reminder of what had been done to me. I had thought carefully about what I wanted it to mean, and what I had settled on was this. It was the last moment before everything changed, the last frame of one version of my life before a new one began. There was something worth holding on to in that, even if the moment itself had been painful. I sat down at my desk and looked at it for a long time. I thought about my mother in the early days of Apex, the version of her I had constructed from photographs and documents and the things Edward Marsh had told me, because I hadn't been old enough to know her as a businesswoman, only as a mother. I thought about the confidentiality agreement she had signed and the patience that must have required to build something quietly, to trust that the right person would find it. She had trusted me with that, without ever asking if I was ready. I thought I understood now why she hadn't asked. After a while, I got up and walked to the window. The Apex offices faced west, which meant that on clear mornings before the Texas heat built up and the horizon went soft, you could see the outline of Houston in the distance. Not the buildings themselves, just the faint suggestion of them, the way a city announces itself from far away. I had left that city with a suitcase and a check and a watch that I didn't know was carrying a secret. It had given me back something I hadn't expected to get. I stood at the window for a long time, my reflection faint in the glass, the city behind it even fainter, the same skyline that had watched me leave, the same distance I had put between myself and everything I thought I had lost. It looked different from here, not smaller, not defeated, just distant, the way things look when you have finally gotten enough space from them to see them clearly. I pressed 2 fingers lightly against the glass. Hey, I thought, I made it. I don't know exactly when I sat down. One moment, I was standing at the window, 2 fingers pressed against the glass, looking at a city that had once felt like a door closing. The next, I was in my chair, hands folded in my lap, the signed contract sitting in a neat stack on the corner of my desk, and the morning had gone quiet around me in a way that only happens when you finally stop moving long enough to let it. I stayed like that for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just being in the room. That sounds like a small thing. It isn't. I spent most of the past few years in a state of forward motion. The next meeting, the next decision, the next piece of evidence, the next step in a plan that I could not afford to let stall. Forward motion had kept me safe. It had kept me focused. But it had also meant that I very rarely stopped long enough to feel the weight of where I was standing. So I sat in the chair, and I let myself feel it. Here is what I know, now that I did not know. the morning I walked out of that house in River Oaks. The hardest part of any difficult chapter is not surviving it. Survival happens slowly, imperfectly, one ordinary day at a time. The hardest part is deciding somewhere in the middle of it that you are going to come through it without becoming someone you don't recognize. I almost lost that. There were nights, long ones, in the early months when everything was still uncertain, and I was still learning what it meant to lead a company and carry a secret and watch my father grow steadily smaller. In the rare phone calls I let myself make when the anger was so clean and so quiet that it felt like clarity. When I understood for the first time the appeal of simply wanting to win, to take everything back, to make every single person who had underestimated me understand in the most precise terms possible exactly how wrong they had been. That would have been so easy, and it would have cost me everything that actually mattered, because power, real power, the kind that stays with you after the headlines have moved on and the legal proceedings are closed and the cameras have gone home, is not built on what you take from the people who hurt you. It is built on what you refuse to become because of them. My mother understood that. She spent years building something, in patience and in silence, and she never once let bitterness shape the blueprint. I found that in the way Apex was structured, in the values written into the founding documents, in the community agreements she had made with the counties she worked in the provisions she had quietly included for the people who would be employed by the projects she never got to see finished, she was thinking about them. Even then, even when she had every reason to be thinking about herself. I think about her on mornings like this, the particular kind of morning that is too big and too quiet to fill with ordinary things. I think about the version of faith she carried that I am still even now learning to hold correctly. She believed that the honest work does not go unanswered, that when you have done what you can with the hands you have been given, you release the rest, not out of defeat, but out of trust. She had made her peace with God about the outcomes she could not control. She told me that once, and I filed it away without understanding it. I understand it now, because there was a night, the longest one, when I had done everything I knew how to do, and the only thing left was to wait. And in that waiting, somewhere around 4 a.m, in an empty conference room in Austin, something settled in me that I have never been able to fully account for in practical terms. A steadiness that did not come from strategy. A sense that I was not, despite all evidence, alone in the room. I prayed, quietly, without any particular eloquence, the way you pray when you are too tired for anything elaborate and too scared to pretend you don't need help. God answered, not dramatically, not with signs, just with morning and with the phone call at 5:50 that told me it was over. I have not forgotten that. I don't think I'm supposed to. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything, is not the outcome. The outcome is its own thing, and outcomes vary. What I want you to hold on to is this: you are allowed to be both strong and afraid at the same time. You are allowed to want justice without letting the wanting go hollow you out. You are allowed to walk out of a room that no longer has space for you with nothing but a suitcase and a watch and the quiet, stubborn belief that your story is not finished yet. It is not finished yet, whatever River Oaks looks like in your life, whatever door has recently been closed in your face, whatever voice has told you to take your $500 and disappear. I want you to know that walking out is not the same as giving up. Sometimes it is the bravest thing available. Walk out and trust the rest. If this story stayed with you, if any part of Serena's journey felt like something you needed to hear today, please leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit closest to home. Was it the watch, the hospital room, the night when everything almost fell apart? And if someone in your life is walking through their own hard chapter right now, share this with them. Not because it has all the answers, but because sometimes the most important thing is knowing that someone else walked through the dark and came out the other side. Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories coming, and every single one of them is told with you in mind. Because here, you are never just a viewer. You are the reason this exists. And for the first time, in a very long time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.